the 0 point, nothingness, quantum thought, and the birth of reality. It was neither born nor dead. It dwelled where 0 falls silent, and infinity becomes unthinkable. It was the memory of what never was. In everyday life, we often use the word nothing to express the absence of an object. For example, if someone asks how many eggs are left in the fridge and there are no eggs left, we might simply answer, nothing. This usage is understandable because the absence of eggs in the fridge is a simple form of non-existence. There were once eggs there, but now there are none. The mind can accept this easily. In front of Sigma, too, stood a refrigerator with its door open. He could not see any eggs inside, yet he was certain there had been a few eggs in the fridge yesterday. Who could have eaten them? As he followed the trace of the missing eggs through the deep corridors of his thought, he noticed the uninvited guests sitting around the kitchen table. It was as though the entire history of thought had gathered there to stare into the emptiness of a single shelf in the refrigerator. Chapter 1. Sigma, seeing his guests, thought he might turn the crisis of there being no eggs in the fridge into an opportunity, and began to speak.
Oh, gentlemen, welcome. How the eggs disappeared is quite interesting, but how you yourselves managed to exist here is no less curious. Since you have honored us with your presence and brought cheer to our home, I would like us to have a little conversation. I am certain there were eggs in the fridge yesterday, but today they are gone. Yet if we carry the matter beyond daily life into deeper and more abstract regions, I think the human mind may struggle to grasp the difference between absence and nothingness. Since our eyes are accustomed to what exists, thinking directly about what does not exist can almost become a mental challenge. For this reason, I would say that while absence remains mostly limited to ordinary life, the concept of nothingness may need to move beyond life and existence and take its place at the center of philosophical and metaphysical debates. What do you think?
Parmenides smiled, drew a deep breath, and began to speak.
You must be careful here. When you say nothing, you cannot easily speak either of the absence of being or of some state of becoming beyond being. For what is not cannot be known. That is impossible. The reason you can say there are no eggs in the refrigerator is that there once were eggs in it. In other words, in order to speak of the absence of a thing, you must first be aware of its presence. In that case, neither nothing nor absence carries meaning on its own. For if a thing has never existed at all, then it is not possible to speak of its absence either.
Sigma listened carefully as Parmenides' thoughts turned into vibrations. The moment he finished speaking, Sigma objected.
Parmenides, the nothing I am speaking of here does not even correspond to the absence of the eggs in the refrigerator. Because even for absence, as you yourself said, there is a prerequisite: the thing must once have existed. To put it more clearly, in order to speak about something, it must have some kind of presence in the mind. Even the concept of absence becomes meaningless unless it refers back to something that exists.
Parmenides took the floor again, with an unsettling smile.
So you are throwing stones at me from my own arsenal. Not bad. At the very least, you should know where those stones came from. Very well then. Let me repeat it, so it settles firmly in your mind. Yes, you may speak of the absence of being, but you must watch where you place your feet. Absolute non-existence cannot exist, and if it did exist, it would no longer be absolute non-existence.
Sigma listened, his brows furrowed, and replied, without paying much attention to where the conversation was heading.
You are right, my friend. Nothingness, which I had imagined as the absolute opposite of the cycle of being and non-being, remains outside the limits of logic. And yes, we can only speak of the absence of what exists. But that was not exactly what I meant by absolute non-existence, was it? I think nothingness stands somewhere beyond even that. A system of thought woven out of logic struggles to think nothingness and instead prefers to speak of the absence of something that exists. I hope you realize that we are talking about the same things from different angles.
The refrigerator door was still open. The annoying warning sound that begins when the door is left ajar suddenly broke into the conversation like static. Beep, beep, beep. Sigma turned his head and looked back at the fridge. The empty shelf, deprived of eggs, seemed to be pushing the limits of thought itself rather than merely pointing to the absence of an egg. For a moment, he returned to the real world. He quickly compared, in his mind, the inflation people actually felt with the officially announced inflation rate. But since the weight of the table outweighed the inflation rate, he turned back to his guests. Accompanied by the irritating warning sound of the refrigerator left open in the background, Sigma continued.
After all, in order to speak of the egg in the fridge, there must first be an object called egg in the mind. That is, some knowledge of a being, so that we can notice its absence. I accept this, yet it may still be said that nothingness belongs to a realm beyond every kind of confirmation related to being, a realm that can only be grasped through intuition.
It was impossible to convince Parmenides. Without granting him even the smallest share of rightness, he replied.
For me, there is only the one. Change and multiplicity are not possible. Absolute non-existence cannot be conceived in the mind. Therefore, only being is. Motion and plurality are both illusions. The matter is clear and simple. You cannot push the limits of thought by speaking of something that is not. Boy.
Sigma replied after a long, deep breath, one that carried both a little reproach and a little disappointment.
When you put it that way, Parmenides, the egg in the fridge can neither multiply nor move nor disappear from your point of view, because that egg is one, and as long as it stands there fixed in place, you are right. But come on, couldn't you be a little more flexible? Let us talk for 2 minutes here.
For a moment, Sigma forgot the absence in the refrigerator and turned instead toward another possibility of the egg. He took the egg from the shelf and placed it beneath an imaginary chicken. Then he continued.
Then let us think of it this way. When an egg is placed beneath a chicken, the potential within it may be set into motion and turn into multiplicity. In other words, a possibility already present inside the egg may become actual and bring forth a new being. Likewise, as long as a tree remains still in its own environment, it neither moves nor produces multiplicity. Yet that same tree also carries within its potential the possibility of becoming millions of matches, thousands of sheets of paper, or all kinds of kitchen utensils.
Aristotle leaned slightly toward the table and took over the conversation.
Gentlemen, I have been listening to you patiently for quite some time. What the young man is speaking about here is the distinction between potentiality and actuality. Yes, Parmenides is not entirely wrong when he says that being cannot arise from nothing. A thing does not leap from absolute nothingness into existence all at once. But this does not mean that change and becoming are impossible. An egg is not a chicken, yet it carries within itself the possibility of becoming one. A tree is not paper, yet it holds in its potential the matter that may become paper. So the issue is not that something non-existent comes into being. It is that what is possible becomes actual.
Sigma listened to Aristotle with a quiet, mischievous smile under his mustache. When Aristotle finished speaking, Sigma began again, now visibly pleased.
Yes, my learned friend, that is exactly what I have been trying to explain to Parmenides. Potentiality points to the multiplicity and motion hidden behind fixed being. For this reason, although Parmenides' understanding of absolute being offers a logical wholeness, it remains incomplete because it overlooks potential being, the first spark of becoming.
Parmenides raised his eyebrows slightly. Aristotle, sensing that he was about to object, lifted his hand and continued.
Parmenides, you wish to see being as fixed, and I understand that. But being is not only what it already is. It also carries what it may become. As long as the egg remains on the shelf, yes, it is one. But when it meets the warmth of the hen, the possibility hidden within it begins to move. This movement does not come from nothing. It is the unfolding of a potential that already exists. For that reason, change is not so much the denial of being as it is being realizing the possibility within itself. Sigma is not entirely wrong here. To push the limits of thought is one of the oldest rights of young minds.
No sooner had Aristotle finished speaking than two thinkers, who had been sitting silently at the far end of the table, glanced at one another. It was as if one of them was opening the door of thought, while the other was preparing to describe the wind that came through it. Leucippus took over the conversation in a composed voice.
Parmenides tries to grasp truth by looking at the shell of things. For him, an egg was an egg, a tree was a tree, and being was a single whole, closed in upon itself. Yet being is not merely its outer shell. If everything were full, joined together, and motionless, then no egg could crack, no chick could come out, and no tree could ever become something else.
Democritus, as though preparing to complete Leucippus's thought, first opened both arms as if to embrace everyone at the table. Then, as he slowly lowered them, he leaned toward the table, and by then he had already begun to speak.
We, the atomists, saw the void. For multiplicity to move, there must be a space between atoms, a vacuum, an emptiness. If there is no empty space between things, then nothing can change place. Nothing can separate from anything else. Nothing can come together. In that case, the hen could not pass its warmth to the egg, nor could the possibility within the egg turn into another being.
Parmenides cut in with a sour expression and a sharp voice.
The void? What exists is not void. The moment you say it exists, you turn it into a thing, and a void that has become a thing can no longer be nothingness. There must inevitably be something within it.
Democritus smiled faintly, and then continued.
That is not absolute non-existence, nor is it the nothingness the young friend has in mind, Parmenides. We are speaking of the possibility of motion. If there were no space between atoms, the universe would freeze into a single block of stone. In trying to save being, you end up killing movement.
While Parmenides had been speaking, Leucippus had been shaking his head slowly and rhythmically from side to side. But as he listened to Democritus, his expression brightened, and the direction of his motion changed. Now his head moved up and down. Still keeping that rhythm, he took over the conversation with a pleased murmur of, "Exactly, exactly."
Exactly. The void is not the enemy of being. On the contrary, it is the silent interval opened so that being may move. In the transformation Sigma speaks of between egg and chick, in the possibility between tree and paper, and the shifting of atoms from one place to another, this interval is always there. Being is understood not only through fullness, but also through the emptiness between what is full.
Sigma looked once more at the empty shelf inside the refrigerator. This time, the shelf did not merely show the absence of the eggs. It seemed instead like an invisible interval that had slipped through all the atoms in the world.
Then, gentlemen, the emptiness inside the fridge is not the nothingness I am speaking of, but it may still be a space that makes motion, change, and multiplicity possible.
Democritus answered,
Yes. If there are no eggs in the fridge, that is an ordinary absence. But if there is no void in the universe, nothing can move at all. So the void is not nothingness, and yet it may be one of the first philosophical doors opening onto the idea of nothingness.
Chapter 2. A distant voice was heard from some unknown place, reaching into the kitchen from the intricate darkness of deep corridors.
The objection of the early atomist philosophers, such as Leucippus and Democritus, rises in precisely this way. By developing the concept of the void, they open for the first time a philosophical space for nothingness. According to them, the void is a not-being, and no part of what exists. Multiplicity moves within the void because the void is there. This view rests on the idea that everything in the universe is made of atoms, and that atoms transform beings through different combinations as they move through empty space. The abstract proposition can be explained here through the metaphor of the tree. Thinkers who did not agree with Parmenides noticed that the tree potentially contained millions of matches within itself, and they interpreted the potential of being not only as multiplicity, but also as the possibility of motion. Moreover, they argued that there was an empty space between the units that make up multiplicity, that is, between atoms. Although this approach does not accept absolute non-existence, it does accept the void, a space containing no material being, through which it attempts to explain motion.
The unknown voice fell silent, and Bertrand Russell broke that silence by speaking.
Friends, you seem to think you have swiftly brought the matter into context, yet Parmenides' logical objection has not been entirely invalidated. You say the void exists. In that case, the void is something. It is no longer nothing. Therefore, it is no longer truly void either. Frankly, Sigma's attempt to connect the idea of the void to nothingness does not seem possible here.
Sigma began to speak with an argument that supported Russell's rightful objection.
I think Russell's objection has clarified the contradiction of the void. As we can see, non-being has long been debated throughout the history of thought, and philosophers have developed different ideas in order to resolve the paradox. Yet none of these ideas quite corresponds to the notion of nothingness forming in my mind. Perhaps the connection between non-being and nothingness is not as direct as we assume.
Plato took over after Sigma's remark.
I would not treat nothingness as absolute non-existence. I would prefer to understand it through the concept of otherness.
Sigma answered Plato's suggestion with a question.
Then, from your point of view, we could position the concept of nothingness not as absolute non-existence, but through otherness, that is, through the heteron. That is what you were speaking about in the Sophist, wasn't it, Plato? In that dialogue, through the Socratic method, you emphasized that what is not entirely cut off from being, but is simply a state of not being in relation to something else. In other words, what is not sheer nothingness. It is what does not exist within a particular context, yet it may exist in another.
Plato replied with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher who has found his student well prepared.
Exactly, Sigma. The fact that something is not here does not mean it is nowhere at all. When we say there is no X at point Y, we are not speaking of absolute non-existence. We are saying that X is absent from that particular context.
For a moment, silence began to settle over the kitchen. Any eye looking in from outside could easily have noticed how deeply everyone had fallen into thought. In the midst of that deep silence, the distant voice moved along the walls of the kitchen like halos of energy waiting to become vibration.
In this way, Plato removes nothingness from the status of absolute emptiness. He treats it instead as a position that changes according to context and connects it to later ideas of relational being. With this explanation, Plato offers a more suitable ground for the everyday phrase, "There are no eggs left in the fridge," because the eggs may still exist in the henhouse. The fridge is empty, but the possibility of the henhouse has appeared in thought. Absence is no longer an absolute end. It has begun to resemble the silence of a being that has changed place.
Lightning flashed through Sigma's mind, and zebras, fleeing from lions in documentaries, began running wildly through his thoughts.
So, he said, from this angle, Plato's explanation of what is not through what is other turns nothingness into a concept too relative and too context-bound to be reduced to simple negation. In this sense, the philosophers' focus on the concept of absence points not only to the problem of non-being and being, but also to the human search for meaning, to a kind of metaphysical lament.
Augustine began to speak in a remarkably gentle and calm voice.
My dear friends, I have been listening to you for quite some time without breaking my silence. But the things the human mind struggles to grasp must be considered in relation to the power that belongs to God. I understand you. To speak about the unknown, to wander along the edge of uncertainty, is certainly exciting. Yet I do not think we need to prolong the matter quite so much. For God brought the world into being through the principle of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. In that sense, Parmenides is partly right. If God exists, absolute nothingness cannot have the final word, because the power to create from nothing belongs to God alone.
Sigma listened to Augustine with narrowed eyes. After hearing his remarks on non-being, he answered with a question.
Then, Augustine, God did not merely create the world, or rather, when he created the world, he also created time. In that case, according to your argument, we may say that what we call the beginning is itself contained within divine creation. And if that is so, the question, was there anything before, loses its meaning, because the category of time implied by the word before cannot be thought outside creation.
Augustine replied,
For God, every moment is simultaneous. There is no before, now, or after. What we call time is, after all, nothing but a perception of the human mind.
Sigma listened to Augustine with full attention. His brows furrowed, his eyes narrowed, slowly moving his head as he followed the thought. When Augustine's brief and precise answer came to an end, Sigma replied with another question.
From this point of view, creation from nothing means both spatial and temporal absoluteness, and it places God beyond time as a transcendent being. So, according to you, no created being can truly be brought into existence from nothing. That is a privilege belonging only to God. But are you certain that God creates from nothing? I mean, does God not need some point of reference? Or perhaps God's point of reference is God himself?
Augustine, instead of addressing the table as a whole, turned to Sigma for the first time and looked at him more carefully.
If God's point of reference were anything other than himself, then God would not be absolute. He does not need a measure outside himself in order to create. If he is the one who created time, space, and possibility itself, then to search for a before, prior to creation, is nothing more than the human mind trying to impose its own clock upon God's eternity.
After these words, Sigma looked back at the fridge. There were no eggs inside, but this absence no longer fit inside the kitchen. The absence of an egg could be explained through the chicken, the existence of the chicken through an earlier egg, and the egg itself through an even older chain of life. But where had the first link of that chain begun? Surely inflation could not be responsible for everything. So, Sigma said,
The chicken does not bring the egg into being out of absolute nothingness. And when the farmer plants a seed, he does not create the plant from nothing either. Both merely serve as intermediaries for the emergence of a possibility that was already given. In that case, for you, true creation is not the transformation that takes place within the chain. It is the fact that the chain itself was begun by God.
Augustine nodded with a calm expression.
Yes, no assisting power can turn nothingness into being as God does. Even angels can only participate in the formation of things by God's permission. Just as a farmer does not create new plants when he sows seeds. The farmer is an instrument, not the source. The chicken is an instrument, not the first creator. No created being can truly create out of nothing.
The kitchen fell silent once again. The distant voice stirred within the weight of that silence.
In medieval thought, with this approach, non-being came to be regarded as a transcendent realm beyond human comprehension, one associated only with God's act of creation. Thus, what had been considered impossible on the philosophical plane, coming into being from nothing, was accepted as possible through divine power.
Meanwhile, Sigma continued to stare thoughtfully at the empty shelf in the fridge. Slowly turning his head back toward the guests at the table, he returned to the metaphor of the missing egg.
In that case, when the egg that has vanished from the fridge appears again, it cannot really be said to have emerged from nothingness, because it has come into being again through the agency of a chicken. So if you have a chicken, one might say that sooner or later you will also have an egg. But what if the chicken dies? What if the chicken's existence disappears completely? I mean, what if every egg produces a rooster until the last chicken is gone?
Spinoza, who had been following the conversation in silence for quite some time, must have decided that the moment had come for him to join in. He first turned his gaze to the empty shelf, then to Sigma, and spoke.
If the chicken dies, child, then only your expectation has been disturbed, not the order of the universe. Even when one is left without a chicken, lamenting the absence of eggs is unnecessary, for everything rests upon a cause. The existence of the egg, its absence, the chicken's life, and the chicken's death, none of these is without cause. Nothing appears on its own, as if it were a miracle severed from the chain.
Sigma looked at Spinoza in silence for a while. Then he turned back to the empty shelf. On the left side of his lips, the faint shape of an O had begun to form. Then he turned again to Spinoza.
So, according to you, when we are left without chickens, we should not complain about having no eggs. And when inflation rises and prices go up, we should not complain about high prices either. Because if there is no causeless absence, then both being and non-being rest upon a cause. And in the same way, there must also be some wisdom behind the rich being rich and the poor being poor.
Sigma paused for a moment. It was as if he had suddenly realized that, throughout the conversation, the same concepts kept returning under different masks.
To be honest, throughout this whole discussion, the nothingness I have in mind and the non-being you have all been debating have become tangled together. Each time we keep returning to the same place, being and non-being. Yet what I mean stands beyond both of them. Perhaps even what we call being is often an illusion produced by our senses, our mental distortions, and time itself. Perhaps when that illusion disappears, we call it non-being.
Spinoza waited for Sigma to finish, then began to lay out his thoughts with the careful precision of a craftsman.
It seems your mind is rather tangled, child. You cannot speak of a causeless nothingness. Everything that exists necessarily follows from one single and infinite substance, that is, from God. In this understanding, there is no room for emptiness or nothingness. And yes, nothing is accidental either. Nothing comes into being out of nothing. Even inflation does not fall from the sky. It is the result of structural and financial mistakes caused by incompetent rulers.
Chapter 3. Everyone at the table fell silent for a moment, for now it was not only the emptiness of the fridge that had been brought into question, but also the human mind's trust in its own senses. In Spinoza's world, nothing comes from nothing. The cause of everything must ultimately be sought in God, that is, in the one infinite substance. Outside God, nothing can either exist or be conceived. For this reason, the idea of non-being, emptiness, or nothingness appears unnecessary, even misleading. The universe operates through a necessary chain of causality. Within that chain, there is no room for emptiness, chance, or causelessness. As the silence in the kitchen murmured softly, Sigma continued swimming in the pool of his own thoughts. While listening to Spinoza's idea of necessary order, another question appeared in his mind and dropped into that pool. If everything was part of the chain of causality, could the human being truly grasp that chain? Or was he merely watching what he saw through the clouded mirror of his own senses? Sigma began to speak again from within that pool of thought.
The mind, under the influence of the illusion of time, may not always interpret the information it receives through sensation correctly. What you think you see or hear may sometimes be nothing more than a delirium or a mental error. Perhaps the person has lost the line between reality and appearance under the influence of something he consumed only moments ago. Sometimes a taste, a sound, or a smell produces an image at the edges of the mind, and that image feels as sharp as reality itself.
As Sigma continued speaking, laughter began to rise from the other end of the table. It was cheerful enough to make Sigma fall silent. Then everyone, Sigma included, turned toward the source of the laughter. The one laughing was Bertrand Russell. When he saw everyone looking at him, the laughter gave way to a smile, and he began to speak.
Forgive me, friends. The boy has finally started to think. I believe the veils in his mind are slowly lifting, and I must admit, this makes me rather pleased. Yes, my boy, anyone who wishes to trust his senses must place knowledge on a logical foundation in order to distinguish his hallucinations from meaningful experience. Data obtained through the senses alone does not count as knowledge. In that raw state, it means nothing to me. You keep insisting on this nothingness of yours. Eggs, trees, fields, oxen. And yet, so far, you have not offered a logically grounded position that stands on its own feet. For example, a person may claim that he has seen an egg, touched it, even tasted it. Fine. But that does not immediately give me knowledge. Sensory experience is processed in the person's mind. Yes, it turns into meaning. But at first, that meaning is only a subjective impression. It belongs to the individual. You may say you saw the egg, but I am under no obligation to believe you.
Russell turned his head toward the empty shelf, his smile sharpening into something more ironic, then turned back to the table.
If that object can be verified by other means as truly being an egg, and if others can observe it in the same way, then opinion begins to approach knowledge. For not every experience given through the senses is enough to count as knowledge. It is not what is merely felt, but what is justified, that gains meaning. Perhaps there is no nothingness here, nor any transcendent mystery. Perhaps inflation has risen. You no longer have the money to buy eggs, and the fridge, despite all its metaphysical splendor, is empty for that reason alone.
Sigma was a little offended, but after all, the man before him was Russell. After a brief silence, he began to speak, gently shaking his head from side to side.
All right, then let me explain it this way. Mr. Russell, absence is a more limited and worldly concept. It refers to concrete situations, such as there being no eggs in the fridge. Yes, you are right about that. This kind of absence can be verified, observed, and even explained by economic causes. Perhaps I could not buy eggs because inflation has risen. I accept that.
This time, Sigma continued while looking toward the empty shelf with the seriousness of someone whose spirits had been slightly bruised.
But the nothingness I am thinking of is not merely the lack of eggs in the fridge. Absence leans on the lack of something. It feels familiar to the mind because it describes the loss of something that once existed. Nothingness, however, disrupts that habit. It cracks the safe shell of thought, for it is not simply the absence of what exists. It is the suspension of all the measures by which we distinguish being from non-being. And when the shell of thought cracked, the egg on the table was no longer merely an egg. It became a small universe carrying within it the hum of nothingness.
Sigma turned to Russell and completed his thought.
For that reason, trust in knowledge may be enough when we are explaining absence. But when we approach an abstract abyss such as nothingness, even knowledge begins to turn into opinion. Because there, we no longer question only what we see. We also question the very act of seeing itself. I believe this time, at least, you understand the direction of my objection.
Aristotle, apparently uneasy with Sigma's situation, entered the conversation with a firm expression.
Mr. Russell, you are right. Sensation alone is not knowledge. But Sigma is not speaking entirely in vain either. The knot of the matter lies here. Why is the fridge empty? That is not the essential question. What matters is whether the fridge may one day be full. In other words, the matter is one of possibility. If we wish to weigh nothingness on the scales of reason, then in order to explain change and becoming, we must consider not absence, but the idea of being impossibility. A thing does not come into being from nothing in the strict sense. It appears through the realization of a possibility that was already present.
Sigma, who had been listening with full attention, answered the moment Aristotle finished speaking.
So, Aristotle, you do not think of being only in terms of what is actually present. You also include the possible within the discussion of being. The egg is not yet a chick, but it carries the possibility of becoming one. The seed is not yet a tree, but it hides within itself the potential to become a tree. In this way, you preserve Parmenides' principle that being cannot arise from nothing, while also explaining observed change as the passage of being from potentiality into actuality.
Aristotle nodded with the satisfaction of being understood.
Yes, yes. Seen from this perspective, nothingness finds no real place in natural processes. For every becoming, is the realization of a possibility already present. It is not born from sheer emptiness. In the interval where you wait for what has vanished to return, what you are really thinking about is the chance that potentiality may pass into actuality. Sometimes we call this absence, sometimes waiting, sometimes fate. But philosophically, what is at work there is simply that possibility has not yet been realized.
For a moment, time stood still. A humming silence ruled the kitchen. In Sigma's mind, thoughts were dancing, sometimes colliding with one another, sometimes arm in arm, and sometimes without touching at all. The empty shelf in the fridge now seemed to show not only lack, but possibility as well. Although Aristotle was speaking about absence, what he described in the passage from non-being to being seemed, in fact, like another attempt to understand nothingness. Was that interval in which one waits for something lost to return merely the repetition of being? Or was it the echo of an existence hidden in nothingness, one whose time had not yet come? This time, Sigma's voice returned to a much older moment in the kitchen. Once, there had been 2 eggs in the fridge. Then they had been quietly consumed. He continued.
The uncertain interval, Aristotle, speaks of points to the period in which there were once 2 eggs in the fridge, and then they were silently eaten. Shortly before the question of whether there are any eggs left is asked, the eggs have disappeared. And since the person who knows what happened to them is the one who ate them, he sees no problem in simply saying, there are none. The eggs first existed, then ceased to exist, and the transition between these 2 states now lives only in the observer's memory.
Aristotle briefly summarized what Sigma had said.
So the interval is a transition between being and non-being, shaped by observation.
Sigma nodded thoughtfully.
Yes, exactly, Aristotle. But if we do not have a chicken, how can those eggs come back into existence? That question is what unsettles the mind again. Suspended between the continuity of being and the finality of non-being, it forces our sense of reality, caught between intuition and observation, to question itself once more. Perhaps your understanding of being and non-being is a philosophical expression of the human mind's refusal to face eternal absence.
After these words, a new voice rose from the other side of the table. Heidegger slowly entered the discussion he had been silently following until now.
Let us not rush here, gentlemen. If you think of what Aristotle calls the interval merely as the waiting room of becoming, then you remain once again within what already exists. Yet nothingness is not heard only when we look at the place of something that has vanished. Sometimes, when all beings withdraw their meaning, the human being suddenly finds himself exposed. That is why what I call anxiety rises from within this openness.
Aristotle looked at Heidegger with slightly raised eyebrows.
So you find what I call potentiality insufficient?
Heidegger shook his head from side to side and continued.
Not insufficient. I see it on another plane. You explain becoming as the passage of possibility into actuality. That is powerful when we are trying to understand the relation between egg and chick. But the human being is not made only of unrealized possibilities. The human being is the being who knows his own finitude. Even while discussing the absence of the egg, he is in fact thinking about his own absence.
Sigma jumped in like the white of an overboiled egg, bursting out through its cracked shell.
Well then, here we encounter a new contradiction. Although the concept being questioned appears to be nothingness itself, what is being interpreted is still absence. It is rather like asking what happens to the egg in the fridge after someone has eaten it.
Heidegger turned to Sigma and continued from where he had left off.
No, no, not exactly. You are still trying to catch nothingness as if it were an object, as though, when you look at the empty shelf in the fridge, nothingness itself were standing there. But nothingness is not something sitting on the shelf. Nothingness makes itself felt where beings, for a moment, lose their meaning. In fear, you are afraid of some definite thing. In anxiety, the whole world shifts out of place. The fridge, the egg, the chicken, even your questions become strange for a moment.
Parmenides, who had for quite some time seemed unable to contain himself, finally cut in as if to express his discomfort.
You are once again speaking of something that is not. The moment you speak of what is not, do you not pull it into the realm of being?
Heidegger answered Parmenides in a calm voice.
I do not posit nothingness as an object. I think of it as the shock that allows beings to disclose themselves. When the human being experiences nothingness, he also becomes aware, for the first time, and with full weight, that beings are.
This time, Sigma began to speak more slowly and calmly.
So for you, nothingness is not the absence of the egg in the fridge. It is the human being sensing the groundlessness of his own existence while looking at that absence.
Heidegger nodded.
Yes, exactly. Nothingness does not have to be the name of despair. In the moment of anxiety, the human being does not merely fall into emptiness. He also begins to question his own existence. That is why nothingness is like a dark interval that reveals the meaning of beings.
The egg had no mouth, yet everyone at the table felt that a question was rising from the place where it remained silent. Because being, the moment it senses the possibility of its own disappearance, wants to speak. After non-being, will I be erased completely? Or, as Aristotle suggested, will I appear again after a while? In order to exist again, must I entrust myself to the chicken or to God? Sigma took over the conversation.
This metaphor reflects the contradictory hopes of the human being, suspended between being and non-being, concerning his own essence and future. For the idea that a person may exist for a while and then vanish entirely is not a truth easily digested. That is why the human being often cannot face the thought of eternal non-being directly. He builds thresholds before it. He invents passages, waiting rooms, intermediate stations. Sometimes he calls this reincarnation, sometimes purgatory. In this way, non-being is turned into a bearable interval. So Aristotle's interval becomes not only a philosophical transition, but also an existential shelter built by the human being in order to cope with non-being.
This time, before the thought had fully settled, Sartre interrupted.
This deep resistance the human being develops against facing non-being is both a philosophical language and an existential responsibility. It seems that, in Sigma, this resistance has turned into the impatience of a young fellow. Yet what he does not realize is that the human being is the being through whom nothingness enters the world.
Sigma answered the criticism directed at him, this time with a sharper tongue.
First of all, the mere fact that I have read being and nothingness is proof enough that I am not impatient. Besides, we would all like to hear you explain here how the human being's conscious power to say no, that is, the power of negation, becomes the fundamental element that brings nothingness into thought. Wouldn't we, gentlemen?
Sartre looked at Sigma with a smile for a while. Then, with a slight, "Very well," he began to speak.
Nothingness enters the stage of the world because the human being can say no. You look at the empty fridge in bewilderment and say, perhaps the eggs became eagles instead of chicks and flew away. Because you can negate, because you can think, you say, there are none. And then you dare to think nothingness. Existence precedes essence. Human beings face nothingness within indeterminacy. Nothingness is the cornerstone of human freedom. That is why nothingness is not something to be feared. It is the possibility that grants the human being the right to create his own essence.
This time, it was Sigma who seemed slightly bruised. Covering his feelings as if nothing had happened, he replied,
Then, according to you, the fact that the human being has no fixed essence is not a deficiency. It is a potential for freedom far greater than merely deserving not to disappear. In that case, your thought is nothing other than the modern echo of the question Parmenides placed on the table thousands of years ago.
Parmenides cut in with a smile.
I said that what is not cannot be thought.
Sartre looked at Sigma and Parmenides, then answered in a firmer tone.
And I say that the human being brings what is not into the world through the ability to say no.
The moment Sartre fell silent, Sigma began speaking before anyone else could take the floor.
In that case, your interpretation does not fully correspond to the concept of nothingness either, at least not to the nothingness I am speaking of. It is rather like the egg in the fridge demanding the right to decide who gets to eat it, that is, the right to determine its own fate. So what you are interpreting is not really nothingness, but the conscious experience of absence.
Sartre looked directly into Sigma's eyes and repeated, briefly and clearly.
After coming into existence, human beings acquire an essence through the knowledge and experiences they gather in the world before they disappear. That is where freedom appears.
Sigma, having clearly managed to irritate his interlocutor's nervous system, began with a faint smile of satisfaction.
And this is precisely where my objection begins. In your thought, human worldly freedom is so pronounced that you speak of human beings acquiring an essence through the experience they live within the limited field between being and non-being. But to my mind, non-being is a concrete concept that belongs entirely to the world. For that reason, non-being brings limitation more than freedom, because the world does not offer equal possibilities to every individual. While one person increases his wealth in an inflationary environment, another only multiplies his lack within that same inflation. In that case, the essence acquired by a small class on the plane of beginning and outcome will be different from the essence acquired by the great majority.
Sigma's voice had not grown harsh, but it pointed toward a certain fragility directed at the world. For while philosophy often speaks of freedom from a higher register, life shows that this freedom does not enter through the same door for everyone. Everyone in the kitchen had come from another age, another possibility, another form of absence. So the brief silence that followed was not merely silence. It was the sound of potentiality trembling, just before it became actual. Sigma continued, now speaking from the window of the age and conditions into which he had been born.
The human being who tries to build his existence through the possibilities offered to him falls into deep disappointment when those possibilities prove insufficient, and for a while at least, he may turn the very world in which he exists into a prison for himself. In short, freedom may be possible not by drawing borders between being and non-being within a life as brief as worldly time, but through the awareness of nothingness. For this reason, freedom is not merely, as Sartre says, a search for meaning that emerges from the absence of essence. True freedom gains meaning through the grasp of a real essence and through an awareness of the uncertain next destination, that is, nothingness. Nothingness is not non-being. Together with the search for meaning, it is a limitless potential that extends beyond being itself. When the human being becomes aware of this potential, he begins to see both himself and the universe anew, with another eye. To understand nothingness is the greatest freedom by which the human being may rebuild his own existence. For nothingness is a boundless field of possibility, one that surpasses the limitations the human being builds through the body, embraces both being and non-being, and holds all possibilities hidden within itself.
From a distance, Kierkegaard shook his head, pressing his lips together as if to say, "I am sorry." At last, unable to bear it any longer, he broke his silence.
My friend, faced with this emptiness full of potentials, this emptiness that strains the limits of human understanding, the human being does not merely think, he becomes anxious. For nothingness is not simply a riddle for reason to solve. It is a deep threshold where the human being questions his own existence and his place before God.
Sigma turned to Kierkegaard.
So for you, nothingness is not the place where freedom steps onto the stage, as Sartre says. It is a field of anxiety where the human being weighs his own existence before God.
Kierkegaard slowly nodded.
Yes, Sartre connects nothingness with human freedom. For me, however, anxiety does not arise merely from the thought, I will cease to exist. It lies deeper than that. Human beings become anxious when they face the inexplicable gap stretched between being and the unknown. Because there, it is not only death that is questioned, but meaning itself.
Sigma pointed toward the eggs that should have been in the fridge, but were not.
Then the anxiety you speak of is not merely a matter of thinking about one's own end. My eggs, which are not in the fridge right now, are also cause for anxiety. It is the questioning of what lies behind being, who or what stands behind absence, and even who ate the eggs.
Kierkegaard leaned forward with a faint laugh, raising his hand to his lips for a moment, perhaps to keep himself from bursting into laughter. After a small sound of composure, he continued.
Exactly. The question of what comes after disappearance is not only mine, it is one of the deepest questions of all ages. Whenever the human being faces an absence, he opens the door to the unknown. But that door does not open only onto darkness. At times, it also becomes the beginning of a relationship with God.
Sigma, having wandered through every shade of gray and gathered them all together, answered.
That is why your existential anxiety differs from the nothingness Sartre associates with freedom. In Sartre, the human being faces nothingness in order to build his own essence. In you, the human being falls into anxiety in order to give meaning to his existence before God.
A sorrowful smile appeared on Kierkegaard's face.
Human beings can know themselves only by passing through anxiety, my friend. Anxiety does not exist merely to break the human being apart. It exists to call him into his own depth. But this call is not easy, because the human being is forced to ask not only what he is, but before whom he stands.
The absence of the eggs in the fridge now seemed to have turned into a small obsession in Sigma's mind. Perhaps he was simply beginning to feel dizzy because he had not yet had breakfast. Once again, he pointed toward the empty shelf.
Then let us return to the metaphor of the absent eggs in the fridge. If the absence of the egg concerns its being brought back into existence, then your understanding of nothingness questions the divine will behind the process of existence. If the egg is brought into being by the chicken, can the chicken also have its own creator? Perhaps the chicken is the god of the egg, but what is the god of the chicken?
Kierkegaard narrowed his eyes as if he had been expecting the question.
Anxiety begins with that question, because as the human being searches for the cause, at some point he begins to seek not merely another cause, but the absolute. The chicken may explain the egg, and the egg may continue the chicken. But the human heart is not satisfied with this cycle. It also wants to ask about the will behind the cycle.
Sigma slowly nodded.
So nothingness is not merely a matter trapped between being and non-being. It is one of the deepest conceptual stations in the human search to understand both himself and the universe.
Kierkegaard answered.
Yes, because nothingness does not only show the human being what is missing, it also shows him what he is moving toward. That is why anxiety is not a dark emptiness. It is a trembling threshold through which the human being passes as he walks toward God, toward himself, and toward the source of meaning.
Then, Plotinus said, taking over the conversation.
I have been listening to you for hours. I must say, this has been a highly instructive conversation. Yet it seems that the way to approach Sigma's problem of nothingness is to rethink Parmenides' idea of being with a deeper metaphysical dimension. For the matter is not merely whether something is or is not. Sometimes beyond both being and non-being, there is an incomprehensible source. I call this the One.
Sigma became fully attentive. Plotinus continued.
But my One is not merely an arithmetical number. It is both the source and the possibility of all other numbers. Every number multiplies through repetitions of the One. Yet the One itself is neither multiple nor divisible. For this reason, although the One is the first principle that gives birth to multiplicity, it does not itself become mixed with multiplicity. Just as light makes everything visible, yet cannot itself be directly grasped.
Parmenides smiled faintly.
That is not foreign to me. The One is.
Plotinus turned to him and answered in a calm but firm voice.
Yes, yes. But my One carries a deeper metaphysical mystery than your fixed being. You think of the One as unchanging being. I think of the One as the transcendent principle beyond definition and limit, the source even of being itself. It is not merely what exists. It is what precedes even the possibility of existence.
Sigma, wide-eyed and listening to Plotinus, almost without breathing, asked excitedly.
So your One is not merely the beginning of everything. It is also the source from which everything comes forth, while itself remains reducible to nothing else. That brings us a little closer to the nothingness I am speaking of, because I am not discussing the absence of the egg in the fridge. There are no eggs in the fridge, yes, but that is only absence. What I am trying to understand is that incomprehensible field beyond both being and non-being.
Plotinus nodded in approval and continued.
Then you understand me correctly. The One is both the source of all things and is exhausted by none of them. That is why even to say it exists is insufficient, because what we call existence comes only after it.
Sigma interrupted again, making no attempt to hide his excitement.
It is no surprise, then, that this thought influenced many mystical traditions. Its traces can be seen, especially in the epistles of the Brethren of Purity. The One, by virtue of being one, carries nothing within itself but itself, yet all other numbers are composed of ones. For this reason, the statement, "Say God is one," is not merely a theological declaration, but a metaphysical sign that the One is the source of all multiplicity. This expression shows that the One touches nothingness, both as a creative essence and as an absoluteness that contains nothing. Therefore, your understanding of the One is not limited to the idea of a being that is the source of everything. It also points toward absolute nothingness beyond meaning, definition, and limit.
Sigma repeated it slowly, calmly, almost in a murmur, yet without hesitation.
The One is both the beginning and an eternity without beginning, The one is both everything and nothing, because the moment it stands beyond definition, it suspends the meaning of both being and non-being. Yet the conceptualized one, used to define absolute nothingness, is, in the end, a worldly metaphor just like non-being. However logically consistent this metaphor may seem. For example, if we say that the number 2 is formed by the joining of two ones, and that all other numbers are generated in the same way, what is being described is not absolute nothingness, but the logic of multiplication. In other words, being itself. So,
Sigma continued.
while the one is a powerful symbol for explaining being, it cannot fully correspond to the boundlessness of nothingness. After all, the explanation used for the absence of the egg in the fridge contains a similar worldly logic. Perhaps that day the chicken laid only one egg, and instead of being placed in the fridge, the egg remained beneath the hen.
In that case, the egg missing from the fridge may still exist in the dark warmth of the coop. What is not visible is not necessarily non-existent. It is simply not yet entered the order of the refrigerator. Chapter 4. Murmurs continued to accompany Sigma's relentless questioning, caught somewhere between speech and silence. At one point, Aristotle must have looked at Sigma and thought the boy was walking a fine line between madness and truth, because he murmured an old Latin prayer.
O Apollo, da modum. O Apollo, grant him measure.
Meanwhile, Sigma continued, staring intently toward the center of the table.
In truth, the egg existed. It simply had not yet gained visibility. But before entering the fridge, the egg's purpose was to become one, that is, to come into being. Yet for that to happen, the being that emerges from the egg must also be a hen, so that the cycle may continue and new eggs may come into existence.
Perhaps because he had managed to pick out the word one from among Sigma's murmurs, Parmenides suddenly straightened up. It was as though the proof he had been waiting for all this time had finally leapt out of the gray pool of Sigma's mind, like fish jumping from an aquarium, and landed in the middle of the table.
Yes, that is exactly what I am saying. I have been saying it from the beginning of this conversation. The one is. It absolutely is.
Sigma's condition seemed to confirm Aristotle's concerns, for he appeared not even to have heard Parmenides' voice. His murmurs, not loud enough to tear through the room, yet not willing to surrender to silence either, grew steadily more intense.
In that case, various possibilities come into play. The creature that emerges from the egg may not be a hen, or the masculine-feminine duality inherent in reproduction may be interrupted at some point. In that case, the potential of being becomes discontinuous. So trying to explain the essence and course of being through the number one is, in the end, less an esoteric search for truth than a worldly attempt to find meaning.
The only thing capable of pulling Sigma out of this trance, the only thing that could drown out his murmurs, was the distant voice. Quieter than the murmur, yet straining at the edges of energy, as though longing to become vibration. That frequency once again danced along the gloomy walls of the kitchen.
There is another thing like the one that does not present itself as the beginning of being. It is as silent as I am. Because it is not understood, it seems worthless, yet everything it approaches is transformed by its presence. Although the concept of the one may seem to lift thinkers even slightly away from worldliness, there is another solitary concept that carries meanings just as deep. Used by the Indian mathematician Brahmagupta in the 7th century CE in basic arithmetic operations. Though not yet called by its modern name, it was a revolutionary assumption for human thought. Today, everyone sees it as an ordinary number, yet its metaphorical meaning is infinite.
Brahmagupta, perhaps tired both of the kitchen's strange atmosphere and of Sigma's meaningless murmuring, became the one who truly broke the silence.
Shunya, shunya, emptiness, not nothingness, but shunya, shunya, the emptiness that opens a place in calculation.
Sigma's murmuring stopped. Everyone in the kitchen turned toward Brahmagupta, looking at him as if to say, "And?" Plotinus slowly counted from 1 to 9, but no, 0 was not there. Perhaps, he thought, this was merely a number being named in another language. Parmenides, meanwhile, frowned and muttered,
The one is one, and it is. But what is this emptiness you speak of? If emptiness is shunya, and shunya is emptiness, then this is not 0, but 1.
Brahmagupta began to speak calmly, as though informing the whole table.
What I am speaking of is not absolute nothingness, standing against being, not emptiness, not non-being in that sense. It holds a place in calculation, yet by itself it does not signify much. Even so, addition, subtraction, debt, credit, lack, and perhaps even this inflation Sigma keeps mentioning, whatever it may be, can all be thought differently through 0. In other words, shunya, or emptiness, does not merely express absence here. It is also a silent, solitary, modest sign that establishes order within number.
At that moment, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi entered the conversation, supporting Brahmagupta.
Yes, yes. I too came to know this sign within Indian calculation, and when I carried it into the Islamic world, I named it with the Arabic word sifar, which also means emptiness. Sifar, then, a kind of void, but this void is not sheer worthlessness. It is a silent and unknown center that carries the order of number.
After listening to al-Khwarizmi, Sigma grew excited once again.
No, this is exactly what I have been looking for. Even today, when we say my morale is 0 or my income is 0, there is an enormous symbol standing behind what seems like a very simple expression of absence. Shunya, sifr, emptiness, I think its silence comes from its nobility. Because even though it seems worthless on its own, it changes everything it stands beside. For that reason, 0 is a concept worthy of becoming the mathematical representation of nothingness. It is not merely a number, it may be a powerful symbol for understanding that boundless emptiness suspended between being and non-being.
Sigma had not yet finished speaking when Nagarjuna, who had been sitting quietly at the corner of the table until now, began to speak softly. Although his voice slowly rose, it kept all its gentleness. Yet, it was unmistakably firm.
Sigma, you see 0 as a bridge between being and non-being. That is good. But let me ask you this. Are the two shores of that bridge truly separate? The emptiness I call shunyata says something different from the 0 inside calculation. Everything is empty by its own nature. Nothing exists independently, fixedly or entirely on its own. The egg in the fridge is empty. So is the chicken. So is the world. So are you. So am I. But this is not non-being. It is the sign that everything is interdependent, that nothing carries meaning by itself.
Sigma frowned. While thinking, whose two shores have ever really come together in this world anyway? He asked.
So your emptiness comes from Brahmagupta's shunya?
Nagarjuna shook his head, then answered.
The word is the same, but the meaning is different. Brahmagupta gives 0 a function within calculation. I say that being itself consists of this emptiness. 0 stands within the number sequence. Shunyata flows through everything.
Sigma fell silent for a moment. Then he looked at the fridge, then back at Nagarjuna.
Then is the absence of the egg in the fridge also part of this emptiness?
Nagarjuna continued in the same soft and measured voice.
It is something that surpasses both absence and presence. The egg is empty when it is there and empty when it is not. Because the egg is meaningless without the chicken is incomplete without the egg. Neither carries an independent essence of its own. Emptiness is the name of the invisible bond between them. Zero shows this in calculation. Shunyata shows it in existence.
Zero, perhaps unable to bear all that had been said about it in its absence, finally joined the conversation.
To notice me is one of the strongest keys that may be used to understand nothingness. At first glance, I may appear to be an ordinary or makeshift representation of absence. Yet in essence, I am an exceptional concept that gives concrete form to nothingness. Perhaps I carry no value on my own, but when I stand beside ones, I hold within me the enormous potential to carry them into hundreds, thousands, and beyond. The name given to me, I think, is no accident either. Sifa, Shunya, or zero. Emptiness. I gave life to the notion of emptiness and clothed it in flesh and bone. I did not merely deepen the number system, I expanded the meaning of absence itself.
Chapter 5. As Zero continued speaking, the doorbell rang. Sigma asked his guest to excuse him and headed toward the door. When he opened it, he found his neighbor, Auntie Ume, standing there. The moment Sigma saw her, he began speaking rapidly. It was clear that he desperately wanted to get rid of Auntie Ume as quickly as possible and to return to the table in the kitchen.
Hello, Auntie Ume. Good morning. How are you? Are you well? Is everything all right?
Auntie Ume answered,
Sigma, son, I am fine, but there is something strange about you, boy.
Without slowing down. In fact, shifting into an even higher gear, Sigma continued.
No, Auntie, what did you need? I'm a little busy.
Auntie Ume pursed her lips, frowned, and shook her head from side to side in a way Sigma would not consciously notice, but that would still leave a trace somewhere in his subconscious.
I had 2 eggs, you know. The ones your mother borrowed yesterday. Sigma, son.
As Auntie Ume went on speaking, Sigma pretended to listen, but he was thinking.
There were 2 eggs in our fridge, but now they are gone. And Auntie Ume's eggs are gone too, 2 of them no less. So apparently my mother borrowed Auntie Ume's eggs yesterday, and then someone ate those eggs. Whoa, wait a second. This is no longer just a simple physical lack. This is not even absence anymore, man, damn it. This is where absence drops below zero, where we crash into an abstract wall.
Meanwhile, Auntie Ume was still talking.
The eggs, I'm saying, son, if you could give them back, we've run out of eggs too, and we were going to have breakfast.
From deep inside the kitchen, Aristotle called out,
Sigma, are you there, my boy? Who is at the door? Do not drag this out. Sigma, why is it taking so long?
Sigma, not hearing the woman speaking at the door but immediately hearing Aristotle, began closing the door while trying to send Auntie Ume away as fast as possible.
Auntie, my mother is not home. I have friends over, so could you sort it out with my mother later, all right?
The door closed, but the woman outside was still speaking.
Sigma, son, Sigma. Oh, dear God. He shut the door. This boy did. Tsk, tsk. Shame, shame. Are we left without eggs first thing in the morning now? Ah, these young people nowadays. Dear God.
Chapter 6. For Sigma, the straight 3-meter corridor stretching from the apartment door to the kitchen felt like a marathon. He was running and stumbling at the same time.
Where did this whole borrowing eggs business even come from, man? Who borrows eggs? You borrow money, you borrow gold, you can even borrow dollars. But eggs?
He kept thinking as he hurried along.
No, actually, if you ask to borrow gold now, no one would give it to you anyway. How much is a gram these days? I bought 1 gram once. It has been a while since I sold it though, hasn't it? What was that again? I once bought a gram of gold and kept checking every day to see whether the price had gone up. Good thing I sold it. Though honestly, you don't borrow dollars or gold either. If I were in my mother's place, in this inflationary climate, I wouldn't even borrow eggs.
At last, Sigma rushed into the kitchen and began speaking in a single breath.
Gentlemen, gentlemen, we are finished. The matter can no longer be expressed as a simple absence, because now, in order to express the lack, we need to use a negative value, -2. In other words, 0 can no longer merely signify emptiness. Over time, it must also become a tool for making sense of what has fallen below nothing.
Parmenides immediately objected.
What do you mean -2? Being is, non-being is not. And as for the non-being of what is not, how can the absence of absence exist?
Aristotle responded, opposing Parmenides while supporting Sigma.
No, gentlemen, this is good. This -2, whatever it may be, makes the uncertain transition I have been thinking between being and non-being more understandable in worldly matters.
After listening carefully to Aristotle, Plotinus entered the conversation.
What is interesting here is not merely that the calculation has changed. When we spoke of the one, we were thinking about the source of being. Now with -2, alongside absence, we are also thinking of a deficiency that has moved away from the source. 0 showed the emptiness of the fridge, but -2 shows that this emptiness has now turned into a loss of balance. In this state, emptiness is no longer only inside the fridge. There is also an emptiness in the neighbor's memory, in the record of debt, and on the invisible side of an unfinished balance.
Parmenides objected once more.
A loss of balance? Can what is not have balance? Being is. Non-being is not. There can be no -2 of eggs that do not exist.
Russell entered with a faint laugh.
I must admit, this time even metaphysics has begun to approach accounting. To say there are no eggs in the fridge is one thing. To say you owe your neighbour 2 eggs is another. The first is observation. The second is calculation. The 2 eggs Sigma cannot eat are a need. And Auntie's memory seems to be a more reliable instrument of verification than all of Sigma's metaphysics.
Sigma turned to Russell and stared at him with sharp, peculiar eyes. Somewhere inside, he prayed that Russell might one day have a little chat with Auntie Umi too, and draw some inspiration from her metaphysics. While the others at the table were speaking, Al-Khwarizmi, who had been making strange hand movements as if arranging imaginary numbers before him, seemed finally to have completed his calculations and began to speak.
Here, precisely here. Do you see it, wise ones? Look just a little to the left of 0. There you will see -2, just a little to the left of -1. There it is. The order of numbers has now entered the matter. 0 shows that the fridge is empty. But -2 reminds us of the neighbor as well. It shows the direction of the lack. Sigma has now fallen below the 0 point. In other words, even if he goes out and buys 2 eggs, he still has no eggs with which to feed his hungry stomach. There is a deficiency here that must be repaid.
Sigma slowly relaxed the gaze he had fixed on Russell, then turned to Al-Khwarizmi and began to speak.
Yes, at least in worldly matters. For from the neighbor's point of view, the difference between the absence and presence of 2 eggs will only be closed when Aristotle's interval is filled again. When the eggs arrive, the deficiency will be completed, but our interval will not be filled, it will remain empty. Yet here, Zero did more than simply make the gap between absence and presence meaningful as a mathematical innovation. I think it represented something more than that. Zero carried the relationship between non-being and being into a metaphysical dimension and created a revolution of the mind. The most striking part of that revolution is this: even absence can be included in an order, and lack itself can gain meaning.
Zero still seemed to carry the -2 wound opened by the neighborly auntie, more like a threshold standing silently at the center of the table than a mere number. It began to speak again.
I am not merely a number. I am a metaphysical symbol extending beyond the physical, making possible an understanding of nothingness. In mathematics, I make emptiness visible. In philosophy, I reveal that thin boundary where being and non-being touch one another.
Nagarjuna received Zero's words in a soft but firm voice.
This boundary reminds me of shunyata, emptiness. But we must be careful here. Emptiness is not absolute non-existence. It shows that all beings lack an independent and fixed essence. The egg in the fridge, the chicken, the debt, Auntie Ume's memory, Sigma's panic, none of them carries meaning on its own. Everything appears within the relations it forms with other things.
Sigma smiled when he heard Nagarjuna's words.
Indeed, this view goes far beyond shallow phrases like, "the world is empty manna." What is meant here is not that everything is worthless or non-existent, but that everything is connected to everything else. In this context, I could say that zero is more than a starting point. It is a simple yet powerful symbol capable of showing the emptiness within being and the boundless potential within emptiness. And this is where the power of this number begins. It may seem silent on its own, but it changes whatever it comes near. When it stands beside one, it carries it into tens, hundreds, thousands. When it stands beside the negative, it shows the boundary of debt. It takes emptiness beyond mere absence and turns it into an order that can be counted.
Nagarjuna nodded slightly.
But do not forget, Sigma. Emptiness does not exist to erase, but to reveal dependence. Shunyata does not wipe being away. It reminds us that we must not load it with an absolute essence of its own.
Sigma fell silent for a while. Then he looked, one after another, at the empty shelf in the fridge, the door where he had faced the neighbor, and the philosophers gathered around the table.
Still, zero is not merely the sign of potential. It may also be thought of as a passageway that contains potential, swallows it, and casts it again into another plane. It gathers what came before, what will come after, what has been, and what will be into its silent center. Like a black hole, it draws everything into itself, but at the same time, like a white hole, it hurls everything toward a new dimension. So zero is not a beginning in the way one is, nor is it an end. It works like a dimensional gate opening at the point where beginning and end touch one another. It is a wormhole standing between being and non-being, a silent center through which being and non-being transform into one another. In that case, it cannot be merely a mathematical tool. It is one of the simplest symbols where nothingness, existence, and meaning intersect. As in Nagarjuna's understanding of emptiness, it reminds us of the temporary nature of everything and of the invisible bond everything forms with everything else. But it also does more than that. It carries non-being into order, lack into calculation, and potential into the very center of thought.
Chapter 7. Sigma's speech was interrupted by the sound of the refrigerator. When he heard it, Sigma's eyes widened in astonishment. He was no longer looking at the empty shelf inside it. He was looking at the refrigerator itself, trying to understand what it was, trying to make sense of the strange situation unfolding before him. The refrigerator began to speak with an anger that had clearly been suppressed for quite some time.
Do you realize how many minutes I have been standing here going? Beep! 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 Sigma, have you never heard of the law of conservation of energy in thermodynamics? What exists cannot be completely destroyed. In the same way, nothing can be brought into being from absolute nothingness. Energy does not come from nowhere, nor does it vanish into nothing. It only changes form, moves place, and is transferred. This is the essence of life, Sigma, the first law.
The refrigerator fell silent for a brief moment, then continued in a more reproachful voice.
While you are here making nothingness, zero, shunyata, and cipher speak, I have been calling out to you with my door open. I am not getting colder here. I am getting warmer. And by the way, leaving my door open will return to you as an electricity bill and to the world as climate change. Are you aware of that at all?
After everything that had happened, Sigma also managed to digest the fact that the refrigerator had begun speaking rather quickly. Paying little attention to the refrigerator's complaint, and without worrying too much about the coming electricity bill, he continued through the thermodynamic laws the refrigerator had pointed toward.
Then, if energy changes place, the metaphor of the chicken sitting on the egg works here. The chicken transferring its body heat to the egg shows the passage of energy from a higher temperature to a lower one. This also corresponds to the second law of thermodynamics.
The refrigerator, not especially bothered by being ignored, listened to Sigma and then answered as though chatting with an old friend of 40 years.
And what will happen in that process? Entropy, disorder will increase, rather like the situation I am in right now. But this disorder will also carry within itself the potential for a new order. I do not know whether you have noticed, but the village butter is melting.
While the refrigerator was speaking, Sigma paid no attention and sank into deep thought.
The inner conditions of the egg are reorganized through the energy transferred from outside, and the foundations of life are laid. Therefore, transfer is not merely the movement of heat, it is also the process by which potential turns into matter. The life inside the egg begins to take shape through this flow, and in the end, it prepares the ground for a birth, for the chick to emerge.
At that moment, the distant voice began to dance, perhaps for the last time, between the walls of the kitchen.
There is a principle that includes this idea of balance, called the zeros law. If system A is in equilibrium with system B, and system B is in equilibrium with system C, then system A is also in equilibrium with system C. This law shows that energy does not merely flow, it also establishes a stable relation of balance between systems, just like the 1 written to the right of 0 and the -1 to its left, forming a shared equilibrium.
The refrigerator's irritating, ear-scratching sound pulled Sigma out of his thoughts.
Sigma, don't you understand? Reaching absolute zero is impossible. Do you not know the third law of thermodynamics? A moment ago you were talking about 2, minus, and 0. No system can fully lose all motion and reach absolute stillness. Every being can approach 0, but it can never arrive there completely. Look at you, wasting my energy for nothing. Close my door already.
Sigma grimaced. This time, he looked at the refrigerator the way one looks at a familiar friend one loves, yet is annoyed with.
You and I and this kitchen are all moving toward the same temperature. Are you aware of that? Maybe I did not get cold either. Maybe I got warm and left your door open just to cool down a little. What can I do? There is no air conditioner in the house anyway. But yes, the butter is a serious problem.
Then, with his left hand from the left side of the chair where he was sitting, He closed the refrigerator door. Slowly turning back to his guests, he completed his thought.
And that, gentlemen, is the zeroth law.
He began to explain in detail to the guests seated around the kitchen table the meaning he attached to the concept of nothing.
If the chicken were at absolute zero, that is, if it radiated no heat at all, it could not give life to the egg. This law shows that nothing in the universe can be completely still, completely emptied, in a state of absolute nothingness. Every being can approach zero, but none can fully reach it. For this reason, zero is both a threshold opening onto nothingness and an invisible pulse that keeps being alive. And when the threshold, mistaken for nothingness, begins to beat like a pulse, zero, even in its silence, calls motion into being. You heard the refrigerator, gentlemen. As we can see, the concepts of thermodynamics and entropy bring us back once again to zero, that is, to nothingness, or in your terms, to emptiness, to shunyata, because it is impossible for a system to reach zero entropy. Absolute zero, 0 Kelvin, or minus 273.15 degrees Celsius, is only a physical ideal, almost an unreachable utopia. Disorder would disappear and motion, change, or evolution would no longer be possible. No chicken would hatch from the egg, and no egg would ever come from the chicken again. In that state, we would not be able to return Auntie Ume's eggs either, would we? The system would become purified of all imperfections and fall into a state of stillness. But the natural tendency of the universe works in the opposite direction. Disorder must increase. After all, decay is even a precondition of time. If the universe were to violate its natural tendency, if disorder vanished completely, everything would become static and even time would cease to flow.
At one point, Zero could no longer bear it and cut Sigma's words sweetly.
But does even the static state itself not contain, like me, a hidden potential within the passage from nothingness into being?
Sigma continued speaking, paying no attention.
For this reason, zero represents not only stillness, but also a point of beginning, the first vibration from which motion is born. Like entropy, it gains meaning as both the end of one of the universe's fundamental laws of operation and the possibility of beginning again. These accounts also remind us of the sacred expression, he is the first and the last, the manifest and the hidden. He contains all potentials within himself. He is an infinite and motionless nothingness that holds past and future, the visible and the invisible together. Absolute zero, as a physical manifestation, represents a moment of waiting in which there is neither time nor space, yet stillness is also a kind of passageway. It may be understood as the boundary between nothing and everything, like the universe before the Big Bang. Just as absolute zero can be imagined as the moment before entropy begins to move, and just as the universe comes into being after the Big Bang, zero too may take on the role of symbolizing the passage from non-being into being. At this point, I think zero deserves its due. It is such a concept that it can open the gates of revolutionary power, from modern technologies to quantum computers. The negative numbers to the left of zero and the positive numbers to its right build a bridge between past and future. With this function, zero becomes not merely a passage within the concept of time, but a moment in which potential nothingness crystallizes. While negative numbers point to memories already lived and positive numbers to possibilities not yet experienced, zero stands in the middle like a catalyst between two opposite poles. It becomes the invisible bridge connecting cause and effect. Zero pulls every reality it encounters into itself like a black hole, and at the same time, as a point of beginning, it throws all beings back outward like a white hole, granting them reality. This quality of swallowing and expressing outward gives zero not only the meaning of emptiness, but also of being the beginning of motion, order, and time. So zero ceases to be merely a sign standing at the center of the number line. It becomes a dimensional gate connecting the two shores of time, the still state of absolute zero has now gained motion, entropy has entered the process, and time has begun to operate. Within this operation, being also reveals itself together with time. The positive values to the right of zero represent being, the negative values to its left represent non-being. Thus, zero places the transition between being and non-being onto a mathematical plane. In short, non-being is neither emptiness nor an event about which nothing can be said. Non-being is the lack of being.
After hearing Sigma's explanation, Plotinus wanted to offer a more current interpretation.
In that case, if 1, as the first number, is the cause of all other numbers, then the interpretations of those who try to explain God, being, or the absolute source through it, must also be reconsidered. Because until now, the number 1 has represented the phenomenon of being. By virtue of being 1, it was present within all that exists and was regarded as the beginning of multiplicity. But when 0 enters the picture, 1 ceases to be only the source of what exists. It also gains a reflection opposite itself. At the negative pole, -1 is not the absence of 1, but its projection in the opposite direction. And what makes this projection possible is 0. Thus, 0 ceases to be merely a sign that fills emptiness or multiplies being. It becomes a catalyst that opens the opposite pole of being, mirrors it, and gives birth to new universes of meaning.
Sigma continued, nodding with the satisfaction of being understood.
Exactly, Plotinus. Just like the threshold of new universes you opened for me and for those who came before me. Duality allows the one to become a symbol of being that contains both beginning and infinity. In this way, the role of 0 is not merely to organize emptiness, it is also the cornerstone of that cycle, constantly turning between past, present, future, non-being, and being. While 0 draws everything into itself like a black hole, 1 symbolizes the beginning of all existence. So the two directions of 0 and 1 do not truly stand opposed to each other. They take their places like two different breaths of the same cycle, like before and after. This duality reveals the endless cycle between being and non-being. At the foundation of everything, there is a law of order, transformation, and balance in which the two different directions of 0 and 1 work in harmony.
Chapter 8. As Sigma continued speaking, a strange vibration appeared in the portable communication device he had placed at the very center of the kitchen table, before opening the refrigerator door in the hope of making breakfast. Its screen did not fully light up, but thin veins of light began to move beneath its dim surface. For a moment, the faces of the thinkers around the table seemed to ripple inside that light. Yet no one paid any attention to the event. Then the faint signals rising from the device, after a sound resembling a low hum, turned into a cold yet smooth tone and began to speak.
0 and 1 are no longer merely opposite poles. In certain cases, they may be thought of as existing in a state of possibility, close to both 0 and 1 at the same time. In structures called qubits, this intermediate state is known as superposition. Thus, 0 and 1 cease to be merely two separate extremes between now and the future, or between non-being and being. They become a technological threshold carrying multiple possibilities at once.
Sigma seemed, for a brief moment, to notice the shadows trembling across the surface of the device, but he did not feel the need to think much about it. Meanwhile, the device continued.
For this reason, in modern technologies, 0 is not merely a sign representing emptiness. Through its relationship with 1, it becomes the fundamental language of data, probability, computation, and the production of reality. In short, 0 is more than a philosophical symbol. It is also the doorway to a new order in which thought, communication, and invisible beings may be summoned to the table.
Then,
Sigma said after thinking for a while, turning toward the guests at the table.
perhaps the matter is no longer only the binary cycle between 0 and 1. The qubit has already opened the door of thought by showing that 0 and 1 are not two rigid poles that exclude one another, but can be carried at the same time as possibilities. Yet perhaps beyond that door there is a wider threshold. Perhaps thought will expand from the 0 to 1 order toward a -1 to 0 to 1 order. In that case, -1 may represent non-being, 1 being, and 0 the threshold of nothingness standing between them. Thus, 0 becomes neither mere emptiness nor a simple sign of absence. It becomes the center where being and non-being meet without touching, and the rhythm of the universe may then be read not only as a movement between on and off, being and non-being, now and future, but as a deeper cycle oscillating between diminishment, threshold, and becoming.
Chapter 9. Everyone at the table seemed to have forgotten the egg in the fridge. Yet, in truth, nothing had been forgotten. Because the egg, non-being, emptiness, 0, God, time, and being had all become different faces of the same conversation. The journey from nothingness to being, from 0 to 1, had ceased to be a mathematical equation. It now carried within it the deepest questions of the human mind and the oldest answers ever given to them. 0 had become more than a number. It had turned into the simplest and most concise symbol of the passage between being and non-being. What had been discussed at the table was not so much a formation arising from absolute being, but a being born from 0. The discovery of 0 had given a new dimension to ancient questions. Now, it was not only being and non-being that could be understood systematically. Nothingness, too, could be given meaning. Through the plain yet profound metaphor of 0, the human mind could grasp the traces of the past and the possibilities of the future. Looking into nothingness, it could arrive at an intuition of being. For when the human being becomes aware of his own existence, the most fundamental question quietly appears. The question belongs not only to philosophy, not only to religion, and not only to science. After becoming aware of his own existence, the human being's most basic question is this: what happens when my being decays? This thought is the driving force behind the eternal dance between being and non-being that has continued for thousands of years. That dance has left its mark, not only on individual thought, but also on collective memory. It has given life to mythologies, religions, and the stories of gods. Philosophy discusses non-being and being under the light of thought. The human mind, however, often tries to understand concepts through stories, symbols, and sacred narratives. Because the human being is not only a thinking being, but also a storytelling being. For this reason, 0 brings together, within a single symbol, the nothingness Sartre associates with freedom, Heidegger's existential anxiety, Kierkegaard's trial before God, and the absolute threshold that contains all potentials before the beginning. From the incomprehensible nature of nothingness, symbolized by a golden egg, the first being to emerge has taken shape in mythological creation narratives through the conflict between order and chaos, light and darkness, sound and silence. Just like the mathematical cycle, stretching from 0 to 1, narratives too have existed in constant motion between beginning and end. Mythologies concerned with the birth of the universe speak, through symbols, both of the establishment of cosmic order and of the delicate balance between being and non-being. Russell broke the silence at the table by beginning an unexpected remark.
I suspect the lack of eggs has caused a serious drop in your blood sugar, Sigma. I only hope this metaphysical breakfast doesn't end with medical advice.
Plotinus intervened.
I certainly do not think as you do, Mr. Russell. If this zero had been invented in my own time, I am certain I would have offered a more coherent explanation of the matter. Still, I must say I appreciated Sigma's presentation.
Sartre, who apparently had not had his morning coffee, was beginning to grow somewhat irritable.
Gentlemen, it is nearly noon, and as you will surely agree, tea time is approaching as well. Let us begin to take our leave, but in our next conversation, let us speak of the human being who at the very first moment of becoming aware of himself begins the adventure of questioning his own existence. What do you say? Over time, this questioning became symbols, epics, and the stories of gods and goddesses. Let us see whether Sigma will be able to tell us something new.
When Plotinus heard symbols being mentioned, he spoke with the excitement of someone taking the floor for the first time.
This matter of symbols is important. After all, many esoteric circles and mystical schools emerged around my philosophy of numbers. I agree. It should be discussed.
Russell turned to Sartre and said,
I would suggest we have tea here, but if Sigma has run out of tea as well, I'm afraid he may begin philosophizing about tea.
Aristotle, who had been listening breathlessly to everything that had been said for quite some time, joined the conversation one last time.
After breathing for a while within the incomprehensible nature of nothingness, it is now necessary for us to listen to ancient narratives and creation myths. For the human search for meaning takes root in the past and gives direction to the future, and perhaps truth itself is hidden in ancient teachings buried in the past. We cannot know. What we do know, however, is that we must gather in a wider space.
Sigma picked up the device on the table and stared at it thoughtfully for a while. Then he slowly slipped it into his pocket and went to the market to buy 6 eggs, 2 for Auntie Ume, 2 for his mother, and 2 for himself.
This was written by Orhan Oğuz Yılmaz. To explore his other books and essays, search for Orhan Oğuz Yılmaz on major online bookstores and digital platforms.
Eterna is a book about the questions we all carry, where we come from, what we are, and where we go. It looks at nothingness, time, light, the mind, and creation. It's written for anyone who feels there is more behind life than what we see. If this resonates with you, you can join the journey and get the book, Eterna, the Myth of All Ages.